Hello everyone, welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow James and Tu Diep as they are suddenly pulled into a dangerous family conflict that threatens everything they hold dear. What begins as a shocking phone call quickly turns into a desperate race against time when James discovers that his own cousin has set a trap to seize his family's fortune by targeting his father. Forced to confront betrayal, greed, and the dark side of blood ties, James must make a choice: walk away again or finally stand and fight. With Tu Diep by his side, this journey becomes more than a rescue. It's a test of loyalty, courage, and what truly defines a family. Stay until the end to see how it all unfolds. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 500 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The city was still asleep when the call came in. James stood by the window of his apartment, staring out at the faint glow of dawn creeping over the skyline. His phone vibrated once, then again, an unfamiliar number. Normally, he would ignore it, but something about that moment felt off. He answered, "Hello?" For a second, there was nothing but static. Then a strained, trembling voice broke through. "James, it's me." His body stiffened instantly. "Uncle Min?" The man on the other end breathed heavily, like he had been running or hiding. "You need to listen carefully," his uncle whispered. "Your father, something's wrong." James frowned, confusion quickly turning into unease. "What do you mean? Where is he?" A pause. Then, "They've taken him." The words hit like a punch to the chest. "What are you talking about? Who took him?" But before the answer came, the line cut off. Dead silence. James lowered the phone slowly, his mind racing. His father wasn't just anyone. He was a powerful man, someone with connections, security, influence. No one could just take him unless a name surfaced in his mind. His cousin, Bao. James clenched his jaw. Bao had always been ambitious, too ambitious. Ever since they were kids, Bao had looked at everything James had with quiet envy. And when James walked away from the company, from the inheritance, from everything, that must have been the opportunity Bao was waiting for. A slow, dangerous realization settled in. This wasn't random. This was planned, and his father was the target. Across town, Tu Diep was arranging vegetables at her small market stall when she saw James's car pull up suddenly, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. She looked up, surprised. "James?" He stepped out quickly, his usual calm replaced with urgency. "We need to go," he said, walking straight toward her. Her brows furrowed. "Go where? What happened?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he grabbed her hands, his grip firm but not rough. "My father is in danger." Her eyes widened. "What?" "I don't have time to explain everything," he said quickly, his voice low but intense. "But I know who's behind it, and if I'm right, we don't have much time." Tu Diep hesitated for only a second. "Then I'm coming with you." James shook his head instantly. "No, it's too dangerous." She stepped closer, her gaze steady, despite the fear rising inside her. "I'm not staying behind while you face this alone." There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt. James looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, the chaos in his mind quieted. Then he nodded. "All right, but you stay close to me, no matter what." The road out of the city stretched long and empty. James drove fast, his eyes fixed ahead, hands tight on the wheel. Tu Diep sat beside him, silent but alert, watching his expression. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. James exhaled slowly. "There's an old factory outside the city. It used to belong to my father before it was shut down years ago." "And you think?" "I think Bao is using it." Tu Diep swallowed. "Why would he do this? That's his uncle." James let out a bitter laugh. "To Bao, family has never meant anything. Power does." He paused, then added quietly, "And now that I walked away from everything, my father is the only thing standing between him and full control." The weight of that truth hung heavy in the car. Tu Diep turned to look out the window, her heart tightening. "So this is about the company, the inheritance." "It's about greed," James corrected, "and desperation." They arrived just as the sun began to rise fully. The factory stood abandoned, its walls worn down, windows shattered, surrounded by overgrown grass. It looked like a place forgotten by time. But as James parked the car, his eyes narrowed. There, a black SUV sat near the entrance. Tu Diep felt a chill run down her spine. "They're here." James reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small flashlight. "Stay behind me," he said. They stepped out of the car. The air felt colder than it should have been. Each step toward the factory echoed faintly, the silence around them almost unnatural. Inside, the building was dim, shadows stretching across the cracked floor. The smell of dust and rust filled the air. "Dad?" James called out, his voice steady but loud. No response. Tu Diep's fingers tightened slightly on his sleeve. "James, I don't like this." Before he could respond, a slow clap echoed from the darkness. Well, I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out." A figure stepped forward. Bao, dressed sharply, completely out of place in the ruined building, his smile cold and satisfied. James's expression hardened instantly. "Where is he?" Bao tilted his head slightly amused. "No, hello? No, long time no see?" "I'm not here for games," James said, his voice dropping. Bao chuckled. "You never liked games. That's why you lost." James took a step forward. "I'm asking one last time. Where is my father?" Bao's smile didn't fade, but his eyes did. "He's safe. For now." Tu Diep felt her heart skip. "For now," she whispered. Bao's gaze shifted to her, examining her like she was an object. "So, this is the girl," he said lightly. "The one you gave everything up for." James moved slightly in front of her, shielding her. "Don't involve her." Bao smirked. "Too late for that." He snapped his fingers. From the shadows, two men stepped forward, dragging someone between them. Tu Diep gasped. James's breath caught. "Dad!" His father looked weak, barely conscious, but alive. Relief hit for a split second. Then anger flooded in. James's fists clenched. "Let him go." Bao shook his head slowly. "You see, cousin, you made a very big mistake." James didn't respond. "You walked away from the company. You gave up your position, your power." Bao stepped closer, his voice lowering. "And you thought that meant you were free." He leaned in slightly. "But all you did was leave everything behind for me." A dangerous silence filled the space. Tu Diep looked at James, seeing something change in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, but something stronger. Resolve. Bao continued. So here's the deal. You walk away again. For good this time. No interference, no returning, no claims. He gestured casually toward James's father. And maybe he walks out of here alive. Tu Diep's breath trembled. James. But James didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on Bao. Cold. Focused. You think I'm going to bargain with you? Bao's smile widened. I think you don't have a choice. Silence, heavy, tense. Then James spoke. Slowly, clearly. You're wrong. Bao's expression flickered just slightly. For the first time in my life, James continued, taking a step forward, I'm not walking away from anything. The air shifted. Tu Diep felt it. Bao felt it. Even the men holding his father tensed. James's voice dropped, sharp as steel. I'm ending this. Right here. Bao's smile faded completely. And for the first time, the game didn't feel like his anymore. For a brief moment, everything stood still. The tension inside the abandoned factory thickened, pressing down on every breath, every movement. Bao's men tightened their grip on James's father, their eyes flickering between uncertainty and readiness. Bao narrowed his eyes, studying James carefully. You've changed, he said slowly. James didn't respond. He simply took another step forward, placing himself fully between Tu Diep and the danger ahead. I'm giving you one last chance, Bao continued, his tone sharpening. Walk away, take the girl, and disappear. Otherwise what? James cut in, his voice calm but dangerous. You'll kill your own uncle. Bao's jaw tightened. Don't test me. James let out a quiet breath, almost like he was letting go of something that had held him back for years. I'm not testing you, he said. I'm seeing you clearly, for the first time. Silence. Then, without warning, James moved. Fast. He grabbed a loose metal rod from the ground and swung it toward the nearest man. The impact was sudden, brutal, knocking the man off balance and forcing him to release his grip on his father. Run! James shouted. Tu Diep reacted instantly, rushing forward despite the fear gripping her chest. She caught James's father before he collapsed completely, struggling to support his weight. Uncle, stay with me, please. Behind them, chaos erupted. The second man lunged at James, but James was already moving, dodging the attack and driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed to the ground, the sound echoing through the empty building. Bao stepped back, his expression darkening. You really want to do this the hard way? James didn't answer. He was done talking. Every movement now was precise, controlled, not reckless, but fueled by something deeper than anger. This wasn't just a fight, this was protection. Tu Diep dragged his father toward the side of the room, her arms trembling under the weight. James, she cried out, panic rising as she saw another man emerging from the shadows. But James had already seen him. He turned sharply, blocking the attack, the metal rod clashing against a knife with a harsh screech. For a split second, their eyes locked. Then James twisted, disarming him and sending the weapon skidding across the floor. The man stumbled back. James didn't chase. His only focus was one thing: getting them out alive. Deep, he called out. The exit, now. She nodded, breathing hard, trying to keep James's father conscious. We're going, okay? You're going to be okay. But before they could move further, a slow clap echoed again. Bao. standing near the doorway, blocking their path. "I have to admit," Bao said, his voice quieter now, colder, "I didn't expect this from you." James stepped forward, placing himself between Bao and the others. "Move." Bao shook his head slightly. "You always were the better one, smarter, stronger." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "That's why I had to do this." Tu Diep froze. There was something different in his voice now. Not just greed, something darker, something broken. "You think this is about money?" Bao continued. "About the company?" James didn't answer. "Ever since we were children, everything was handed to you," Bao said, his eyes hardening, "while I had to fight for scraps." "That's not an excuse," James said firmly. Bao's expression snapped. "It is to me." A tense silence fell again. Then Bao slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Tu Diep gasped. "James!" Time seemed to slow. James didn't move back, didn't hesitate. He just looked straight at Bao. "If you do this, there's no turning back." Bao's hand trembled slightly, but his eyes didn't. "There was never a way back for me." He raised the gun, aiming directly at James. Tu Diep's heart pounded violently. "No, please, stop." James took one step forward, then another, closing the distance. Bao's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't come any closer." But James didn't stop, because behind him, Tu Diep was holding his father. Because this was the moment everything came down to. "Go ahead," James said quietly, "if this is who you've chosen to be." Bao's hand shook harder now. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, a weak voice broke through. "Bao!" Everyone froze. James's father, barely conscious, but awake. Bao's eyes flickered. "Uncle, you still have a choice," the older man whispered, struggling to breathe. "This isn't you." For a moment, just a moment, the gun lowered slightly, and in that moment, James moved. He lunged forward, grabbing Bao's arm and forcing it upward just as the gun fired. The shot echoed loudly through the factory, the bullet hitting the ceiling. Tu Diep screamed. The struggle was immediate, violent. Bao tried to pull free, but James held on, twisting his wrist until the gun slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. Both of them staggered back, breathing hard, facing each other. But now, everything had changed. Bao looked at James, something shattered in his eyes. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. "Why do you still protect him, after everything?" James didn't hesitate. "Because he's my father." Simple, unshaken, real. Bao let out a hollow laugh. "And what about me?" James looked at him for a long second. "You chose your path." Silence, then slowly, Bao stepped back, not defeated, but empty. "I lost, didn't I?" James didn't answer, because deep down, they both knew. Bao glanced once more at the man on the ground, then turned away. "Go," he said quietly. Tu Diep blinked in disbelief. "What?" "Take him and go," Bao repeated, his voice flat. "Before I change my mind." James didn't move at first. He studied Bao carefully. Then, without another word, he turned. "Diep, let's go." Together, they helped his father out of the factory, step by step, not daring to look back. Hours later, the hospital room was quiet. Machines beeped softly, steady, and reassuring. Tu Diep sat beside the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Her hands were still slightly shaking, but her eyes never left the man lying there. James stood near the window again, just like that morning, but everything felt different now. Behind him, his father stirred slightly. "James," he turned immediately. "I'm here." The older man looked at him, his gaze softer than James had ever seen. "You came back." James shook his head. "I didn't come back for the company." A pause. "I came back for family." The words lingered in the air, heavy, but healing. His father closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "That's enough." Days later, the world outside seemed quieter, simpler. James stood beside Tu Diep in front of a small house on the outskirts of the city. Not a mansion, not an empire, just a home. "You don't regret it?" Tu Diep asked softly. James looked at her, then at the house, then back at her again. "No." He reached for her hand. "This is everything I chose." She smiled, her eyes warm, despite everything they had been through. "And your father?" "He'll be okay," James said. "He understands now." A gentle breeze passed through, carrying with it a sense of calm that neither of them had felt in a long time. For the first time, there were no threats, no shadows, no one chasing them, just peace. James tightened his grip on her hand slightly. "Let's go home." And this time, they really meant it.